The day my son Nolan and his wife Sloane moved into my house. I knew living together wasn't going to be a walk in the park. I'd been a widow for 10 years, living quietly in my two-story home in Pasadena, complete with a little bougainvillea garden out front. It was my sanctuary, built with years of hard work and care. Nolan had recently lost his job, and Sloane, who had a habit of living way beyond her means, insisted they would save money by staying with me for a little while. I took them in because Nolan is my flesh and blood, but I kept my eyes wide open. They had barely crossed the threshold when Sloane dropped her boxes dead center in the hallway and eyed my walls with obvious distaste. She let out a theatrical sigh and pointed at my curtains. "Nolan, babe, we really need to update this space. It smells musty and dated," she said, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing less than 3 feet away. I didn't burst into tears or act visibly offended. I simply walked over, grabbed her heaviest suitcase, and dropped it right outside the guest room door at the end of the hall. "Here is your room," I told her, my voice completely neutral. "The common areas are staying exactly as they are. If you think it smells musty, the window's open on this side." Sloane blinked at me in shock, clearly expecting me to either start an argument or cower in embarrassment, when I gave her neither. She forced a tight smile and dragged her feet into the bedroom. That very same night, I noticed she tried to move one of my living room armchairs to make room for her ring light. Without saying a word, I got up, grabbed the other side of the chair, and moved it right back to its original indentations on the rug. We locked eyes. She blinked first. The first boundary had been drawn. But I knew perfectly well that a woman accustomed to running the show wouldn't give up on day one. What Sloane failed to understand was that my patience wasn't weakness. It was just observation. By week 2, Sloane's money-saving plan started showing its true colors. I came downstairs to make my morning coffee and found my pantry completely hijacked by imported oat milks, overpriced artisanal cheeses, and organic jams. My own groceries had been shoved all the way to the back, practically hidden. To make matters worse, she had left a $320 Whole Foods receipt sitting on the kitchen island, right next to my keys, like it was an unspoken invoice. Nolan came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, followed by Sloane, who promptly sat at the counter waiting for someone to serve her. "Joanne, we left the grocery bill right there," Sloane murmured, inspecting her manicure. "Since there are 3 of us now, I figured it's only fair you cover half, right? I mean, you're going to be eating it too." I picked up the receipt, read it over slowly, and then dropped it right into her lap. "I already did my grocery shopping on Tuesday. Sloane, my food is on the bottom shelf," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "I don't eat goat cheese or smoked salmon. From now on, everyone pays for what they eat." Nolan tried to intervene, stammering that it was fine and not a big deal. But I had already grabbed my purse. I drove straight to the local hardware store, bought a deadbolt, and installed it on the large hallway pantry that afternoon. I let them have the small kitchen cabinets. When Sloane saw the padlock, her face completely twisted, but she couldn't say a word without sounding ridiculous. I wasn't denying her a roof over her head, but I absolutely was not going to fund her luxury lifestyle under the guise of shared expenses. That night, I heard tense whispering coming from their room. Nolan was trying to calm her down while she hissed indignantly. I just turned off my bedside lamp and slept like a baby. The silent turf war for control of the house had just leveled up. By the second month, Nolan's unemployment felt more like a comfortable routine than a crisis, and Sloane's presence was seeping into every corner of the house. She started having her friends over for afternoon tea, playing the role of the lady of the manor. One afternoon, I came back from running errands to find the door to my study wide open. That room was sacred to me. It held my sewing machine, my favorite books, and all my important documents. Sloane was inside with a measuring tape, accompanied by two of her friends. And we'll just rip out this old desk to put in a built-in closet. Nolan needs space for his suits. And I want a little reading nook right here. She was explaining enthusiastically. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Her friends looked immediately uncomfortable, but Sloane kept her rehearsed smile plastered on. Oh, Joanne. We were just taking some measurements. This room is so underutilized, and we really need more space. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene in front of her guests. I simply walked into the study, took the measuring tape right out of her hands, rolled it up, and slipped it into my pocket. Visits happen in the living room. Sloane, everyone out. Please, I said, gesturing toward the hallway. But Joanne, we're just planning. She started to whine. Out, I repeated. My tone was so icy and resolute that her friends immediately grabbed their purses and practically sprinted out of the house, muttering quick goodbyes. Sloane stood in the hallway, fuming. The next morning, we didn't argue. I just called a locksmith, bright and early. By the time she woke up at noon, my study featured a high-security lock, and I wore the only key on a chain around my neck. She tried the handle a couple of times that afternoon, rattling it uselessly. She glared at me from across the living room with a resentment she didn't even try to hide anymore. But she knew there was nothing she could do. The boundary was physical, and it was absolute since she couldn't take over my space. Sloane's resentment morphed into a new tactic, trying to demean me in front of an audience. In November, she decided to host a lunch party to celebrate Nolan's new business venture, which, in reality, was just a vague concept. They invited some of Nolan's former coworkers and their wives. From the moment she woke up, Sloane commandeered the kitchen, dirtying every pot and pan and leaving the place an absolute disaster. When the guests arrived, she greeted them with wine glasses out on the back patio. I was sitting in the living room, quietly reading a book. Sloane rushed inside, wiping her hands on a towel. Joanne, the roast is almost done. Can you start slicing the bread and carry the salads out to the patio? Oh, and get the guests some more ice. We're running low, she ordered naturally, exactly as if she were speaking to the hired help. I looked at her over the rim of my reading glasses. I carefully bookmarked my page, set the book down, and stood up. What are you waiting for? Hurry up before it gets cold, she snapped, actually snapping her fingers at me. I walked straight past the kitchen, grabbed my purse and a light cardigan from the coat rack. Hope you all enjoy your lunch. I'm going to go see my friend Lorraine, I told her, pulling the front door open. By the way, you left the oven on way too high. The meat is going to burn. I walked out and pulled the door shut behind me, leaving Sloane standing there with her mouth hanging open. I had a lovely afternoon with Lorraine, drinking coffee and eating pastries. I didn't come back until after the sun went down. When I walked in, the house was dead silent. Nolan was standing at the sink looking exhausted, scrubbing a mountain of dishes. Sloane was locked in their bedroom. Nolan looked at me, hesitated for a second, and then dropped his eyes back to the sink. He finally understood that I wasn't there to serve anyone, least of all to save his wife's fragile ego. December rolled around, and the tension in the house was thick, though mostly silent. Sloane barely spoke to me, which frankly gave me immense peace. But mid-month, she played her grand hand. We were in the kitchen. I was brewing some chamomile tea while Nolan scrolled through job listings on his phone. By the way, Sloane announced out of nowhere, we're hosting Christmas here this year. I already invited my parents, my siblings and the kids, my aunts, and a couple of cousins. There's going to be 22 of us. Nolan's head snapped up, the color draining from his face. He knew they didn't have a dime for something like that. Sloane side-eyed me, clearly waiting for me to naturally assume the role of the accommodating grandmother who would finance and cook the entire thing. "It'll be a great opportunity for the family to see how well we're doing," she added. I took a slow sip of my tea. I didn't panic, and I didn't argue about a 22-person invasion in my home. "Sounds good," I replied calmly. Sloane's face lit up with a triumphant smirk. "I'll take care of roasting a small turkey for me and Nolan. It's a tradition. But the rest of the menu and entertaining your guests is entirely on you." Sloane. "And, obviously, on your dime." Her smirk vanished instantly. "But Joanne, it's dinner for 22 people. I don't have time to cook for that many. And Nolan hasn't even gotten his first advance yet," she yelled, her voice pitching up. "Then I guess you'll have to order catering or cancel," I said, rinsing my mug in the sink. "I am not financing or cooking a banquet for your family. You have 2 weeks to figure it out." I walked back to my room, ignoring her frantic complaints. I knew her pride would never let her cancel. What I didn't anticipate was the sheer audacity she would bring to the table that night. But I wasn't going to sit around waiting. That very afternoon, I started putting my own plan into motion. The days leading up to Christmas were a masterclass in orchestrated chaos, courtesy of Sloane. She maxed out whatever was left on her credit cards, buying cases of wine, gaudy centerpieces, and overpriced, pre-made food. I stayed completely out of it. Keeping my word, I bought a modest turkey, prepped it with my grandmother's recipe, and made 2 simple side dishes. While Sloane was busy barking orders at Nolan and loudly complaining about how exhausted she was, I made some quiet, strategic moves. First, I packed up all my sentimental valuables, framed family photos, and the good silverware, locking them securely in my study. I wasn't about to let a herd of running children and careless adults ruin my memories. The day before Christmas Eve, Sloane demanded to use my fine china, the set I kept displayed in the dining room hutch. "No, Sloane, those are for my family's special occasions. You can use the everyday plates or buy heavy-duty paper ones," I told her flatly. She huffed and slammed the cabinet doors, but didn't push the issue. That night, while the 2 of them were dead asleep, I slipped into the guest room and quietly pulled 4 of their suitcases out from under the bed. I methodically packed up a good chunk of their clothes, their essential toiletries, and the shoes they wore most often. I did it calmly, folding every piece, and then stashed the loaded bags in my bedroom, right behind the door. I knew the dinner was going to be the breaking point. Sloane was cracking under the financial pressure she'd created, and her ego was bruised because I refused to bow down. She was going to try to humiliate me in front of her family to make herself feel like the boss. I was just setting the board so she could play her final hand. Setting. By 7 p.m., the house was completely overrun. It was loud. Coats were thrown haphazardly over my sofas, and kids were tearing through the hallways. Sloane's family walked in greeting her like she was the lady of the manor. I stayed in the kitchen, quietly tending to my turkey, dressed nicely, but practically. Nolan barely mumbled 2 words to me. He was too busy playing bartender and pretending they had it all together. At 9 p.m., Sloane loudly announced that dinner was served. The massive group herded into my dining room. Sloane's father took the head of the table, the exact chair I had sat in every holiday since my husband passed. Sloane took the seat to his right, and her clan filled in the rest of the chairs. Nolan was squeezed into a tight corner at the far end. I picked up the carving knife, placed my turkey on a small serving tray, and walked into the dining room. When I got there, I realized there wasn't a single empty chair left for me. I stood right in the doorway, holding the tray. Slowly, the loud chatter died down as people noticed me standing there. Sloane looked at me with absolute, freezing arrogance. tilting her chin up in front of her 22 guests. "Looks like I'm short a seat," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the sudden, awkward silence. Sloane set her wine glass down and let out a dry, humorless laugh. She leaned back in her chair, emboldened by her audience. "You don't belong at this table, old woman," she snapped, a vicious smirk spreading across her face. "Go eat in the kitchen. We're having a family dinner here." The silence in the room became suffocating. Nolan squeezed his eyes shut and dropped his head, completely incapable of standing up for his own mother. Sloane's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but nobody uttered a word. I took in the scene for 5 long seconds. With utter calm, I set the carving knife down on the buffet. I didn't scream. I didn't shed a single tear. I turned on my heel and walked slowly back down the hall. I could hear Sloane let out a mocking little giggle behind me, resuming her conversation as if she'd just won the war. But I didn't go to the kitchen to hide. I went straight to my bedroom, grabbed the 4 suitcases I had packed the night before, and calmly rolled them to the entryway. I unlatched the front door and threw it wide open. The freezing December air rushed in, sweeping straight down the hallway and into the dining room. Then, I walked back to where everyone was seated. I stopped right at the edge of the table. "Sloane left out a tiny detail on her invitations," I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the room heard me crystal clear. "And that is the fact that she and Nolan are living here on my charity. This house belongs to me, and people who disrespect me under my own roof do not get to eat in it." Sloane's father stood up quickly, his face beet red. "Mrs. Joanne, please, this is just a misunderstanding." "There is nothing to misunderstand," I interrupted him, keeping my tone perfectly polite but refusing to give an inch. "Dinner is over. I'm going to have to ask you all to grab your coats and leave." Sloane shot up from her chair, absolutely livid, slamming her palms on the table. "You can't kick us out. It's Christmas Nolan. Say something to her," she shrieked, totally losing her polished composure. Nolan finally stood up, looking pale as a ghost. "Mom, please, don't do this right now." I ignored him and pointed straight down the hall. "Your bags are already by the front door. You have enough in there to spend the night at Sloane's parents' house. You can come back for the rest of your things tomorrow afternoon. While I am out, you all have 5 minutes to clear out of my house." There was no rage in my voice, just an unbreakable finality. And when faced with absolute, unwavering resolve, bullies always fold. Sloane's family didn't wait around to see what would happen next. The humiliation was far too deep. In dead silence, the aunts, uncles, cousins, and siblings started pushing away from the table, actively avoiding eye contact with me. They scrambled to grab their coats off the couches and practically marched out the door I had propped open, muttering scattered, awkward apologies on their way out. Sloane was frozen in place. Her big night, her grand moment to humiliate me and crown herself the new matriarch, had completely imploded in under 10 minutes. She watched in shock as her own parents walked toward the exit without saying a word to defend her. "This is illegal. You can't just throw us out like this," she threatened, though her voice was shaking violently. I walked over to the console table and picked up the set of keys Nolan always left in the dish. I slid my house key off the ring, kept it, and held the rest out, including the keys to their car. "Your clothes are right there," I said, pointing to the suitcases. "If you aren't out that door in 2 minutes, I am locking the bedrooms and you'll be spending Christmas Eve sleeping on the lawn. Nolan, take your wife and go." My son looked at me with a brutal mix of sadness and deep shame. He knew he had crossed a point of no return the second he let her speak to me that way. without intervening. He took the keys from my hand, grabbed two of the suitcases, and gripped Sloane by the arm. She tried to yank away, crying hot tears of pure anger, but for the first time in months, Nolan's grip was firm. "Let's go, Sloane." "Enough," he muttered, his voice cracking. They crossed the threshold. Sloane shot me one final, venomous glare, but I just pushed the heavy wooden door shut right in her face and threw the deadbolt. I stood alone in the hallway. I listened to their car engine start and fade away down the street. The silence that settled over the house wasn't empty. It was the heavy, beautiful sound of peace returning to its rightful place. Christmas morning, I slept in. I made myself a fresh pot of coffee, carved a generous plate of leftover turkey, and ate my breakfast sitting right at the head of my table. No one came knocking for the rest of the luggage that day. Nolan sent a quick text saying they had rented a small moving van for the following afternoon. I didn't text back. That same afternoon, the locksmith came back and replaced every single exterior lock on the house. It was the best Christmas present I could have ever given myself. When they came for their boxes, I didn't open the door. I had left everything perfectly boxed up on the porch. I didn't see Sloane. Nolan slipped a note into the mailbox begging for forgiveness and explaining they were temporarily crashing in a tiny apartment. It was 2 full months before I agreed to see my son. We met at a neutral coffee shop across town. He looked thinner, completely deflated. He spent an hour apologizing. I listened, reached across the table to squeeze his hand, and gave him the hard truth: I loved him. But I would never, ever live with him or his wife again. My house is my sanctuary. Nolan, you are always welcome to visit, but she never crosses that threshold again. And you only come when you are invited. He nodded slowly. He understood that the bridge he had burned couldn't be rebuilt with just a few tears. Today, my garden is blooming, and my afternoons smell like chamomile and old books. All my life, I was conditioned to believe that being a good mother and wife meant constantly biting your tongue, making yourself small, and keeping the peace at all costs. But if this whole ordeal taught me anything, it's that peace, bought with submission, is a scam, and respect doesn't come with an expiration date. It's not about holding a grudge or seeking revenge. It's about recognizing that your dignity is non-negotiable. Sometimes, the bravest act of self-love doesn't require screaming or throwing a fit. It just takes opening a door, setting a hard boundary, and knowing deep down that it is never too late to finally choose yourself.